Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. I'm Chidera Esum, and I'll be taking you through the stories dominating today's headline. Firstly, The Punch, which is boldly written on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. NUT strikes begins as Tinubu sends 1,000 forest guards. At the top of the newspaper, bad loans rise after CBN ends forbearance. The bad loans has rise as CBN has ends their forbearance. You'll find that on page 30. Still in the same newspaper, on page 8, US commits $3.5 million to monitor Nigerians' religious violence. The US has committed $3.5 million to monitor Nigerians' religious violence that is happening. You get that on page 8 of the Punch newspaper. Away from the Punch newspaper to the blueprint. On the blueprint, you will see where Tinubu deploys tactical rescue team, 1,000 forest guards. At the top of the newspaper, Igbo needs Nigerians, not Biafra agitation. Soludo tells Southeast. Soludo tells Southeast that the Igbo needs Nigerians, not Biafra agitation. To get that story, you go to page 20. Still on blueprint, NNPC boasts Nigerians' fiscal strength as profit climbs 481 billion naira. The NNPC has boasted Nigerian fiscal strength as their profit climbs to 481 billion naira. To get that story, you go to page 22 of the Blueprint newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, ADC crisis, court to hear Bala Gombe suit against Mark Arabeshola Wednesday. On Wednesday, the ADC will be going to court for their ADC crisis to hear Bala Gombe's suit against Mark and Arabeshola. To get that story, you go to page 3. Away from the Blueprint newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune, boldly written. Tinubu approves recruitment of 1,000 forest guards. To get that story, you go to page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. At the top of Nigerian Tribune newspaper, Obafemi Awolowo Future Leaders Fellowship Program opens application across African diaspora. Obafemi Awolowo has Future Leaders Fellowship Program, and he has opened application across Africa and diaspora. To get that story, you go to page 4 of the Nigerian Tribune. At the bottom of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper, NNPC generates 5 trillion revenue as crude oil output hits 1.68 MPD. The crude oil has hit 1.68 MPD, and NNPC has generated 5 trillion naira revenue. You get that story, you go to page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Benga Hashim imaged Accord Party presidential candidate. Benga Hashim has images Accord Party presidential candidate. To get that story, you go to page 23 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Away from the Nigerian Tribune newspaper to the Matrix, boldly written. Adoption and banditry. FG finally swings into action. The federal government has finally swings into action of the adoption and the banditry, especially the one that has happened in Oyo State. To get that story, you go to page 2 of the Matrix. At the top of the Matrix newspaper, First Holdco secures shareholders' approval for 1 trillion capital, signaling bold strategic reset. First Holdco has secured shareholders' approval for 1 trillion naira capital, and they are signaling bold strategic reset. To get that story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, ADC crisis gets messier as Nafiu Bala faction unveils presidential candidate. The ADC crisis gets messier as Nafiu Bala faction unveils presidential candidate. To get that story, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Makinde appeals calm as NUT declares indefinite strike in Oyo over adopted teachers' school children. Governor Makinde has appealed to calm the NUT that has declared indefinite strike in Oyo over the adopted teachers and school children. To get that story, you go to page 2 of the Matrix. Still in the Matrix, at the bottom of the newspaper, I'm not part of any city boys group, Davido tells critics. Our popular celebrity Davido tells critics that he's not part of any city boys group. To get that story, you go to page 23 of the Matrix. Away from the Matrix newspaper to the New Telegraph, boldly written at the top of the New Telegraph, federal workers threaten nationwide strike over insecurity and wages. The insecurity that has been happening in our country has warrants federal workers to threaten nationwide strike, especially the one that has happened in Oyo State. To get that story, you go to page 2, 5, and 6 of the newspaper. UAE relaxes visa restriction on Nigeria. Trade hits $5 billion. The UAE has restricted the visa on Nigeria as their trade hits $5 billion. To get that story, you go to page 25 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, ex-political allies force set for battle as 2027 presidential candidates emerge. Who are the political allies here? To get that story, you go to 9, 10, and 11 of the New Telegraph. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent, which is boldly written on page 3. Tax hikes, rising costs drive decline in Nigeria's air travel. The tax hikes and the rising costs have driven decline in the Nigerians' air travel. To get that story, you go to page 23 of the newspaper. Tinubu okays 1,000 forest gas for Oyo after school adoption. We pray that the students comes out safely. To get that story, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. WEF warns of new inflation shock for Nigerians. Others. WEF has warned of new inflation shock for Nigerians and others. To get that story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, APC primaries. Tinubu intervenes to resolve nationwide crisis. President Tinubu has intervened to resolve nationwide crisis and also the APC primaries crisis. To get that full story, you go to page 29 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, federal government economic reforms yet to fully impact business, says NECA. The NECA has said the federal government reforms have not fully impacted businesses. To get that story, you go to page 7 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor, boldly written, Tinubu still on adoption of Oyo students. Tinubu approves 1,000 forest gas for Oyo deploys rescue teams. Tinubu has deployed 1,000 forest gas to rescue the Oyo victims that have been adopted. At the top of the newspaper, IGP cautions against indiscriminate recording, circulation of officers' videos. The IGP has cautioned against indiscriminate recording and circulation of officers' videos. The videos that we, the citizens, normally take on the officers. The IGP has cautioned against it. To get that story, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Nigeria can't be intimidated by insurgents, says First Lady. The First Lady has said that Nigeria can't be intimidated by insurgents. To get that full story, you go to page 2 of the Daily Monitor. Still in the same newspaper, Vice President won't be spared tire in my government, says Peter Obi. The former Anambra State Governor Peter Obi says the Vice President won't be spared tire in his own government. To get that full story, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, economic reforms yet to fully impact businesses, says NECA. The NECA has said that economic reforms that Tinubu made have not fully impacted businesses, which means the business area of Nigeria is still going down. To get that story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. Away from the Daily Monitor newspaper to the Guardian. States reel from 13 trillion naira loss ahead of 2026 severe flooding prediction. To get that story, you go to page 6. They are still predicting if there will be flooding this 2026. At the top of the newspaper, Obi pledges to up power generation to 10,000 MW if elected president. You get that story in page 3, where former Anambra State Governor, who is also a presidential candidate under the NDC party, says he's going to power generation of 10,000 megawatts if elected president. We just hope that he keeps to his words. Extension on tables as insurers mix May capital verification deadline. The insurance has missed May capital verification deadline, which there has extended it, but the date hasn't been reviewed yet. To get that story, you go to page 22. Still in the same newspaper and still on Oyo school adoption. Teachers begin strike as Tinubu deploys special rescue team. In Oyo State, the teachers has gone for strike as Tinubu has deployed 1,000 forest guards to specialize in rescuing the Oyo adopted. To get that story, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Why court is in favor of DSS operative in defamatory suits against Serap. To get that story, you go to page 14, where it's written that why court is in favor of DSS. Is court really in favor of DSS to operate in defamatory suits against the Serap? Still in the bottom of the newspaper, Flutterwave promotes over 100 employees, launches global cost of living relief package. The Flutterwave has promoted over 100 employees and has launched global cost of living relief package. To get that story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard, on page 11 of the Vanguard newspaper, education, medical tourism, drive foreign travel spending to $6 billion. Under the education sector and medical tourism has drive foreign travel spending over $6 billion. To get that story, you go to page 11 of the Vanguard. At the top of the newspaper, First Holdco secures shareholders' approval for 1 trillion capital. The First Holdco has secured shareholders' approval for 1 trillion capital, says signaling bold strategic reset. To get that story, you go to page 49 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper and still on Oyo school adoption, Tinubu deploys 1,000 forest guards tactical team. We just hope that the 1,000 forest guards that Tinubu has deployed will be able to rescue the Oyo adoption. To get that story, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, governments face fierce battles to retain seats, produce successors. Still on 2027 election, the upcoming 2027 election, the government has faced fierce battles to retain seats and produce successors. To get that story, you go to page 5 of the Vanguard. Away from the Vanguard newspaper to the Daily Trust. On page 4 and 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper, you get how General Rabe wife were ambushed, adopted in Katsina. Still on banditry and kidnapping, General Rabe's wife were ambushed and adopted in Katsina, and they haven't been rescued. Why court is in favor of DSS operative in defamatory suits against Serap. To get that story, you go to page 18, where court is in favor of the DSS operative and defamatory suits against the Serap. Lastly, on Daily Trust, Buni administration at 7. The governor of Yobe State, Mai Buni, is celebrating his administration at 7. To get that story, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. That's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Esom. Do have a beautiful day.